the thing that people need to understand is that we don't have direct elections in the United States, and the primaries play a particular role in the decision-making of the two permanent political parties in choosing their candidates. So it's a process that reflects the political motion of different tendencies at the base, and it's also a process that reflects the relative strength of different contenders. So usually there may be a few contenders in each party, and they sort of have a public tussle before they have a series of primaries in each state, and a lot of electoral power rests at the state level, not at the national level, because of the complicated way our electoral system is set up to sort of dodge democracy. This year, however, it became clear not too far into the primary season that both the political parties were in sort of a state of crisis. And this was marked most clearly by the meteoric rise in the Republican Party of Donald Trump, who is not really a politician per se. He's a real estate magnate who is whose main business has been self-promotion for several decades. And then on the left, the rise of Bernie Sanders, who is contending for the Democratic nomination, but he's never actually been a Democrat. He's worked with Democrats in his positions as a member of the House of Representatives and as a member of the Senate, but he has always run as an independent. And so he was the only independent in the Senate for the last few years. And for him to take a stand of running against the sort of presumed candidate of the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, was a bold stand to take. But what was even more surprising was that he actually generated a huge amount of support. Now, what makes that particularly significant is that he's an open socialist, and it's in the United States, you might as well say you're an open member of ISIS. To say, I'm a socialist and I'm running for president, it's assumed you're either crazy or a completely marginal candidate who can be overlooked without even thinking about it. Yet, Sanders has drawn enormous support from surprising sectors of the society with minimal money at his disposal. And so when we look at this particular primary season, it's absolutely extraordinary. The picture of America that both the world and Americans are presented by American mass media is mostly false. The decline in living standards, particularly since the financial crash of 2008, has been precipitous. It's affected what was once known as the middle class. People understand it to be something that's rapidly shrinking. I know that's not unique to the United States, but if people had any illusions that the United States was exempt from it, they should forget that. It's happening really hard, really fast, and people who for generations saw their future as one of permanent upward mobility are now faced with the sudden loss of stability that's wrenching. And so in some ways, it's your classic situation where you see that kind of polarization, but you have to include the added aspects of the particularities of American society and American culture, and the fact that there's always been a racial divide in the United States from its formation because of the crucial role that color played in the slave trade and the role of slavery in actually building up the country in the first place. The period where people are singled out for harassment both by police and white civilians for the color of their skin is with us today, and in some cases it's actually getting exacerbated. Now, why is that particularly happening now? Well, as I said, there's that kind of polarization where people who feel that their life security is under threat lash out at the people below them economically rather than the people above them economically. If they were in that precarious middle position, that's they're going to go after the easy targets, and they're easily manipulated into that kind of racism and xenophobia. But the other factor which has to be taken into consideration is that when a black man was elected president, it rocked the culture to its foundations. You can't see it overtly in examining American TV shows or American music, but in fact that happened for millions and millions of people who just in having to make the choice of Barack Obama over Hillary Clinton in the primary in 2008 and over John McCain in the fight in the presidential race, forced people to take a look at where their sympathies lay in light of both the history of racial division and racial dominance for white people, and in light of the fact that that system had been brought under hard challenge by social movements in the United States, and that had resulted in some breakthroughs for black citizens, for brown citizens, and other non-whites to come in and actually take part in the power structure. Okay, so there actually was a political class formed out of the support that communities gave to political contenders and then elected officials, whose whole political careers were made possible by the struggle to enfranchise people of color in the United States. That's a reality that had not dawned on a lot of people in the United States. And when it began to dawn on them, they had to make a choice. And the majority of the voters chose to oppose racism in the 2008 and 2012 elections, which is actually extraordinary in itself. In fact, it was something that until Obama actually started to show that he had real political strength among Democratic voters in 2008, it was assumed across the board that it was, like the Jesse Jackson campaign, chaotic. At the same time, there's a similar choice that's being made by many white people. That's the choice that most people of color have had to make a long time since, was to decide whether their interests lay in partnership with capital and hoping that that would filter down into some kind of benefit which would result in a secure life. Well, again, it's unique for a lot of different reasons, and some of those reasons aren't really even discussed in the national dialogue about the election. What most of the discussion is trying to nail down exactly how the Sanders campaign can be written off as a flash in the pan, when in fact it's extremely significant. People have to understand, when they look at the history of the United States and when they talk about the question of a socialist running for president, the last time an avowed socialist ran for president and received even close to 1 million votes was 1912. That was Eugene Victor Debs, who ran on the Socialist Party ticket in 1912, which was one year where there was actually more than two parties in contention for the presidency. But it was a high point in popularity for the socialist movement in that particular period. Now we've got a very different situation, okay? The repression against socialism has made it, has demonized any form of socialism, even the far right-wing socialists that supported the Vietnam War. There were people who, for whatever political reason, came from the socialist heritage that existed in the United States, which ranged, which included communists and social democrats and Trotskyists and Maoists and what have you. They all were forced into the shadows essentially by both government repression and a nonstop propaganda effort to demonize the left. And so when you would talk about the left just a year ago in this country, what people would think of was Hillary Clinton, who basically stands to the right on a lot of positions of Richard Nixon, okay? Bernie has actually changed all that because not only did he step out front and say, I'm a socialist and I'm going to run for the Democratic Party nomination, but then people responded to it by saying, well, if what he's talking about is socialism, that sounds great to me. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of the young people who are coming into college age or passing out of college now missed the worst of the repression of the left. They missed the worst. I mean, at this point, if you were trying to talk like J. Edgar Hoover used to talk about how there are communists under your bed and they're going to come out at night and strangle you in your sleep, that's dismissed as silly. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover, who once terrorized the entire nation, is now considered kind of a figure of fun historically. He's the closest thing to a really powerful fascist in the 20th century in the United States. The new generation, as I say, when they look back on that, it just seems like a joke. And, but of course it wasn't. They weren't affected by that, but that means that they're not afraid of socialism, essentially. They're ready to at least consider it. Now, what is it that Bernie says that's so appealing? Well, he's an experienced politician. He's worked mostly in one state, a mostly white state, for decades, building a coalition of supporters from a broad range of the population. And what he stood for are basically not so much socialist as anti-neoliberal demands. So he focuses on the aspects of U.S. society today which are anachronistic, except for the fact that neoliberalism and a runaway free market economy has made it impossible to propose certain things which are commonplace in many other countries, such as national health insurance, such as free higher education, such as laws regulating the influence of huge amounts of money on the political process, which greatly undercuts democracy and grossly gives the benefit to large corporations and the super rich. He speaks directly to those issues. Okay, he speaks directly with proposals that are not proposals that he cooked up himself, but are the reflection of proposals that have come out of social movements over the last few decades. There has long been a movement in the United States for single-payer health insurance, something along the Canadian model, which is not so radical, but compared to what even Obama was prepared to propose through his famous Obamacare package, it's beyond the bounds of that. So so when Bernie started talking about single payer, he wasn't talking in a vacuum. There had already been a movement afoot in just, I think, in every state that had been talking about single payer for a long time and had actually garnered a lot of support. So that immediately resonated. Free higher education is an issue that's extremely important because, as Bernie has pointed out very, very well, the cost of student loans, which is basically the cost of tuition, which it has put higher education out of reach for most students, so they have to apply for student loans, which are impossible to pay off in this economy, has amounted to a situation where young people are punished for wanting to go to college. They actually are paying they're paying their lives away just in order to go to college, when the value of a college education in itself, in terms of leading to a secure life, has been broken down quite a bit by the recession. So talking about free higher education, which, as I said, is a simple investment in public education, which could be easily paid for by cuts in the military economy, by transaction taxation of financial speculators, things like that, are basically laughed off even by Hillary Clinton as being impossible to pay for, because they can't even conceive of infringing on the tax benefits and the freedom to make enormous profits that exist for corporations, for banks, and so forth, and of course can't conceive of any kind of cuts in the absolutely ridiculous budget of the Pentagon, which is, you know, I mean, any small amount of research will show people that it's beyond belief. It makes Kafka look like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. Well, I mentioned before about the way that the social movement for black equality and for voting rights led to the formation of a black political class which was much more marginal now and is now strong enough to actually put forward a candidate who wins the general election. We're talking about social movements that now have been around for several decades, and you can look at three key social movements and see how their role gets complicated in the current Democratic Party race. And that would be labor, the movement for black freedom, and the women's movement, okay? And in each of those cases, you have a leadership layer that, one way or another, is tied into the political apparatus of the Democratic Party, okay? In the case of labor, that's longstanding. It goes back to the days when Franklin Roosevelt actually made it possible for industrial organization to take place on a mass scale, and he needed a strong working class as an ally against the right wing of capital in order to save capitalism in the 30s. When he basically gave the green light, when he indicated that he was going to stop holding back industrial organization and strikes, the huge movement that resulted from that was the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which became a steadfast ally of the New Deal and the Allied effort in World War II, and all basically because of their tight alliance with Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt died and the Democratic Party shifted to the right, that posed a crisis for the labor movement. The level of political influence that existed during Roosevelt's lifetime, that was undercut seriously. There was a purge of leftists from the labor movement and so on. So you have a whole history behind the close ties between the labor movement, the organized labor movement, and the Democratic Party, even though the Democratic Party is neither a labor party or a social democratic party in any sense, except maybe if you're looking for an equivalent, you have to turn to the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party, like a lot of social democratic parties now, but has been, but in the case of the Democratic Party, has been for a long time, is basically first and foremost an ally of capital and a tool of capital in most respects. But it also relies heavily on the labor movement for its funding, for example. So it's a very complicated relationship, which is easily boiled down to, you know, good guys, bad guys, but that doesn't really get to the gist of it. But what that means in terms of this race is that most of organized labor is pretty solidly behind Hillary. The base is different. There actually is a movement which includes a few unions that actually supported Sanders, like the communication workers, and a lot of rank and file members of the unions who favor, and locals of the national unions who favor Sanders and who want to get the message across to their leadership that their vote doesn't come that cheap. Now, in the black movement, it gets even more complicated because in there you actually have a clear generation gap between younger blacks who are in the same position as younger whites in regards to looking ahead to an insecure future and having to deal with the problems of paying for higher education, with the added additional factor of having to face every day a police department locally from coast to coast, engaged in the kinds of pointedly racial physical attacks that used to be considered the work of mainly of vigilantes more than police. Now, in fact, police have always done this, but partly because of social media and partly because of the racist backlash against the Obama's election, it's become more commonplace. I'm talking about murder, torture, and an incarceration rate which is staggering. So young black men are, Bernie actually cites this quite a lot. The number of young black men who are likely to be imprisoned compared to the number of young black men who are likely to graduate college. It's stark. So why do black people in some sectors of the black community vote for Hillary? Partly it has to do with the fact that the social movements and other institutions that played a part in the social movements that helped create that political class are tied in with that political class. And that political class, so now I'm talking about black elected officials in the main, but certainly not not an overwhelming majority, but a majority, have had to fight for their position and maintain it in the Democratic Party, and they've been able to accumulate a considerable amount of clout within the Democratic Party. How far that goes in terms of clout in relationship to the forces of the neoliberal business forces that are actually drastically undercutting the livelihoods of black people, working class black people from coast to coast, that's a serious problem, particularly for those black people who look to that class for leadership. But they've worked, a lot of them have worked closely with the Clintons, including some legendary figures like John Lewis, who was one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. On the one hand, the idea that we can form a wing inside the Democratic Party that might be considered Sanders Democrats is very likely. It's actually something that's already happening. The idea that that wing can take over the party is a much harder thing to consider a possibility, at least in the short run. And in the long run, we all die anyway, so all we can do is wait to see what develops over the next few years. But when it comes to affecting the policies and the direction of the Democratic Party, that is probably the main reason why Democrats are preferable to Republicans, because if you're looking for an anti-neoliberal party, you don't look to the Democrats. But if you're looking for a party where social movements can actually have a certain amount of leverage in the direction that policymakers take, elected officials and others connected with the Democratic establishment, there is leverage. You know, the issues, all the issues that Hillary Clinton talks about reflect the demands of social movements. And the stronger that social movements get, the more that it forces the party from rhetoric to action. But it's all, you know, the question is that enough? And people who on the left who say the Democratic Party is not our friend, and I think they're perfectly right to say that, but they then go on to say any work with the Democratic Party is basically just feeding the beast, which I think is makes great sense if we lived in a world of good guys and bad guys, but in terms of the political situation that we're in, with where the left has been and continues to be really isolated and small and fragmented and politically incoherent, that doesn't make any sense at all. We have to work with Democrats, not all Democrats. We have to oppose some Democrats. The right and center right wing of the party has to be opposed. Their elected officials have to be drummed out of office, the same as with Republicans. But you're going to have to work with center left and left Democrats in order to get that done if you don't happen to be identified with the Democratic Party. However, it gets and remains complicated around the question of how much power can we actually hope to get in the Democratic Party. And but there's a mirror question to that, which is how much power and influence can the left expect to get if it completely shuns and sets itself in opposition to the Democratic Party and to all the people that it represents, who are basically people who identify with social movement demands. And that's a question which actually the Bernie campaign has brought to the fore, and there's always been a lot of debate, but now the debate has something much more concrete to work around, and I think it's actually helping to cohere the left, the American left, politically in a way that nothing else has been able to in quite some time. Well, the potential is there, and it hasn't been this strong in many years. Okay, we've seen it before. We've seen it, the possibility in the Jackson campaign, but again, there's complicated reasons why that couldn't come to fruition. We've seen it in the attempts back in the 60s and particularly in 1972, where the peace movement and the civil rights movement were actually able to push aside the Democratic establishment and push forward their own progressive candidate in the form of George McGovern, at which point there was a united front of establishment Democrats, Republicans, and virtually every part of the American ruling class to crush McGovern, which they did. He won, he only won one state, and it wasn't even his own. And that was held up as an object lesson to Democrats for decades after. Don't even think about somebody as far left as, well, let alone Bernie Sanders, as far left as Elizabeth Warren, because that's going to scare away the voters who want a right-wing government. I don't think that was ever really true, but it brought about the steady drift from the center-left to the center-right, and in some cases all the way to the right for leading Democrats. So, what's the possibility today? As I say, the potential is definitely there, and there are efforts being made both in the Bernie campaign, which is essentially a political campaign that has caught fire largely through the internet, and social movements that have been active for a long time, and including some newer social movements that are coming from mainly from young workers, students, and just young people who have come to the point where they can recognize injustices that they want to organize against. Okay. There's a distance between political movements and social movements. Social movements often are more broadly based and speak directly to particular constituencies. Political movements have a more general diffusion in the population and are usually centered around candidates and election times. But they have a common, in this case, they actually have a very important common goal, and they each have something to teach the other. There's a big schism between them, but if that schism can be breached, and in particular, if the Bernie campaign can recognize and reach out to social movements and start to learn about the work that's being done and the people who are involved in that work and start to share their political experience, then I think you have the basis for a new social and political force in the United States, which could eventually become a serious national opposition. But it's not going to happen by magic. It's not going to happen strictly by computer clicks or by calling a meeting and then declaring a new coalition. That gets done like several times a year by various different organizers, and that's not what's going to do it. It's going to have to be, for lack of a better word, a knitting together, careful knitting together of people who are, practically one-on-one, breaking through the little bubbles that the fragments of the left have built around themselves, and start to recognize that if we can get together, we do hold the prospect of having the kind of fundamental transformation that everybody on the ground envisions. Starting that process in our lifetime rather than having to wait for the next generation or the next or the next.